But first, all this week we're asking some distinguished Americans to talk about the people and events that have shaped our century.
For me, there are two discoveries of the 20th century that rise above all others in significance, and they each happened in the 1920s. First, we learned that our Milky Way, our home galaxy, was not all there was to the universe. That in fact, there are other galaxies filling the voids of space. Shortly after, Edwin Hubble discovered that all these galaxies are hurling apart from each other. Therein is the expanding universe. What a concept, an expanding universe. What that tells us is that, in fact, the universe was smaller in the past and had a beginning. And for the first time, we can think of the universe, our home, as something that had a beginning, a middle, and possibly even an end.
I'll be right back, but first, all this week we're asking distinguished Americans to talk about the people and events that have shaped our century.
The immigration experience, because I'm a descendant of early immigrants in that wonderful 1900 to 1925 when 1 million people a year were coming here, mostly from Europe. They wanted freedom, they wanted a better life for their kids. They wanted to educate us highly because they weren't educated. They believed that the streets were paved with gold, and when they got here, they found out that they weren't. It was rough sledding. But where they came from, they were really oppressed or repressed. And you got to tell your kids in each generation what freedom really means to them. This is a very unusual country of a couple hundred years.
I'll have more news when I come back, but first, all this week we're asking some distinguished Americans to talk about the people and events that have shaped our century.
Being in the technology and being in the internet world, for me, one of the most striking moments was when I realized that the internet has truly become a medium. This was, I guess, late in 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, and it was the internet that told me that this thing had happened before the television and the radio and the newspapers. And for me, it was significant because I think that for the first time, I think the news was really being used on the internet as a medium.
More news when we come back, but first, every night we're asking some distinguished Americans to talk about the people and events that have shaped our century.
If it hadn't been for all the technological advance of the 20th century, as a seriously disabled person, which I never expected to be, I would really be in bad shape. I'm a survivor because of surgical advances and equipment that first allowed me to stay alive and then develop some quality of life. But I'm grateful for the technology that's filtered down to help disabled people lead more productive lives.
I'll be right back with more news, but first, all this week we're asking distinguished Americans to talk about the people and the events that have shaped our century.
Technically speaking, that wonderful double-stranded helix molecule, the DNA, has, I think, revolutionized how we view science, what we can do with science. I have great hopes that with our understanding of genetic mapping, that we're going to be able to cure diseases that have afflicted us from the beginning of time. And I love what it's done for fighting crime, because we can identify people to the exclusion of all others for the most part, and take these perpetrators off the street. I think that DNA typing, DNA profiling is one of the greatest advances of the century.
I'll be right back, but first, all this week we're hearing from some distinguished Americans on the most important people and events of the 20th century.
Going through World War II, not on a battlefield, but in a small town in Illinois as a high school student, and what the war did to bring that small community and, in effect, the whole country together, we collected scrap iron we collected, newspapers. We did everything we could. I worked on the ration board, and I could see then what America could be like, and I pray to God that America someday achieves that kind of democratic intimacy again.
Millennium begins. NBC is there for 23 hours from 20 countries with all the stories, all the stars, and all the celebrations. Join Tom Brokaw and Katie Couric live in Times Square. Start the Millennium with NBC News, sponsored in part by Renaissance Hotels.
I'll be right back, but first, our continuing look at what some prominent Americans feel were the most important events and people of the 20th century.
Well, I think that one of the most important people and events of the 20th century was what Mahatma Gandhi, in freeing India and speaking up for nonviolence and speaking up against racism and poverty in his own land and for freedom and justice, was a bellwether of where we've got to go in the 21st century. Our American prophet, Martin Luther King, who tried to apply that in the civil rights movement and trying to help America live up to its potential and the promise of the Declaration of Independence, told us that there has to be another way, that our scientific and technological progress must be leavened by our moral vision.
The new millennium begins with NBC, live from around the world. Today, nightly news and Dateline, continuing coverage on MSNBC, the global markets on CNBC, and local reports on your NBC station. Join Tom Brokaw and Katie Couric live in Times Square. The new millennium starts on NBC.
We'll be right back, but first, our look at what some prominent Americans feel were the most important events and people of the 20th century.
To me, the most important medical advance of the 20th century was the development of penicillin. How many of us would be here today if it weren't for penicillin and the other antibiotics?